With the extreme possibility of escalation occurring over in Eastern Europe, you have to ask yourself this question. Are you ready for this? Are you prepared for whatever a conflict might bring with it and what might happen during a conflict, especially if it ends up in your own backyard? And this is why we need to discuss things that have happened in recent history to get a better idea of what we should expect and prepare for. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper. Today we're talking about what we need to prepare for in order to deal with what's going down right now. We're being told that this is going to happen one way or the other, and we need to understand what to expect and what to prepare for when it comes to conflict, especially in the modern era. And now we know that certain events are going to occur based on historical precedent, and then we can also talk about some of the wisdom from people who have lived through similar conflicts, especially in that region, to get a better idea of what you and I should expect if this thing spills over and becomes a global scenario. And if you're worried about preparing for this possibility to become a reality in your own backyard, then hit the subscribe button below, because hopefully these conversations can keep us on the same page and make us focus better on what we need to be working on right now based on current circumstance. So back in 2014, during the incursion of Crimea, and even in the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, the first thing that Russia did when invading those countries was eliminate communications. They cut the internet, they got rid of phones, and any outside communications were extremely limited or completely severed in order to stop whatever news might be coming out of those countries from reaching their allies or anyone else on the outside. So that is an expectation we should definitely have in the very beginning or any precursor to a conflict. And the US is already warning us here at home about the possibility of cyber attacks on our infrastructure, which means grid down scenarios are possible, the internet could go out, and cell phone and everything else that we rely on in the sense of communications could just suddenly go black. So these are things we have to understand, we have to prepare for now, and we also have to understand are likely to occur if this conflict escalates to a larger conflict. So, based on that, what else can we learn about things that happened recently? Well, we can take the wisdom of people who have lived through recent conflicts in modern warfare to give us a better idea of what to expect during a conflict like what we could see happening over there right now. And it is naive to assume that nothing like that could ever happen here or in your country or wherever you are just because it hasn't historically happened before. That's not how preparedness works. We prepare for possibilities, whether or not they are likely or unlikely, because either way, they're still possible. And this is something we have to definitely remind ourselves from time to time here in the preparedness community. Now, the siege of Sarajevo. This is something that happened during the Bosnian War, okay? And if you're not aware of where Bosnia is, I'll put a map up so you can see it, and it is right next to Croatia. So all of you who like to carry around your Springfield XDs, say hello to your neighbor. Now, here's the thing. The siege of Sarajevo, which Sarajevo is the capital city of Bosnia, lasted almost 4 years, okay? A very long time. And a lot of terrible things happened in that city during that time while they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. And many of you will remember some of these events from the early 90s. It happened between, I believe, 1992 and 1996 or somewhere within that timeline. Correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments. But either way, this was the longest siege on a capital city in the history of modern warfare. You have to understand that, of course, these things have happened in ancient times, but in modern era, this was the longest siege of any capital city in recent history. And this is something you have to understand because the people who were there lived through hell and lived through real SHTF. And luckily for us, not luckily for this person, people put out information talking about what happened there and what they learned from it in regards to preparedness. Now, Words from a Bosnian Survivalist is an article that's an interview with someone who survived the Bosnian War in Sarajevo for a year. And that person's name is Selko Begovic. Okay? Now, Selko Begovic tells us what happened during that time, what to expect during conflict like what we saw in Bosnia, and what we should really focus on when it comes to preparedness. So I'm going to share some highlights with that article or from that article with you right now. So that way we can actually be aware of what to expect if any of this was to unfold in our area, and what we can expect for the people of Ukraine during these times, and anything else that could occur in the future, okay? So after a month or two, the gangs started operating. And we know that that is definitely something that we prepare for in the sense of marauders, right? But at the same time, you have to understand that it only took 30 to 60 days before gangs started organizing and then doing as they will to the people around them and taking what they wanted by force. So it's not very long until that starts to happen during these situations, okay? Now, there are no more police at that time either. And so say goodbye to first responders, it's out the window. And the same goes for hospitals at that time as well. There's no more staff at the hospital, there's no way to get medical care, and there's no one to call in an emergency, okay? Then the MREs are being dropped by foreign aid because the US was dropping MREs in the area during that time, weren't enough food. So even if there is foreign aid or military aid of some kind, you can't rely on it to actually be enough. And it will never be enough for some people, as some people always feel they should have more, no matter what their desperation level is. So also keep that in mind, because food became very scarce very quickly in that region, okay? Now, cash became worthless. All right, basically the money of the country didn't mean anything at that point in time because there wasn't any real value to it. So trade did come into play, but there was some big caveats and big factors involving it at the time, all right? The most valuable things during that time were firearms, ammunition, candles, lighters, gasoline, and batteries, and of course, food as well. And so those things are things you should think about when it comes to your preps. Do you have enough of those things? Not just for the idea of possible trades or bartering or anything like that, but in the sense of the reason they were so valuable is because they were so useful and so necessary to survival. So those are things to keep in mind. You gotta remember, there was no power, there's no water, all that stuff was going on during this time, during the siege of Sarajevo. And this is a big deal because this is recent. We're talking the early 90s here. This is not 1930s anything, okay? Then, trade exchanges were organized and they were publicly held, which was great. But the problem with that, and like I said before in our recent barter video that we like to enjoy, I'm sure, just gonna throw it out there, is that these trade exchanges were publicly held, well organized, but also included a lot of very heavily armed people to maintain that level of organization. The issue there also was getting to them because the road to get to them was too risky most of the time. So even though there was organized trade available, getting to it was so dangerous that most people still didn't take that risk anyway. So these are other things to consider that could definitely be possibilities depending on where you are, all right? Anything that could burn for heat or for cooking was burned. So furniture, doors, window frames, everything was thrown into the fire because they needed it for heat and they needed it to cook. And they burned things for heat rather than using fuel because fuel became more valuable than staying warm. So this is how priorities change during these times based on scarcity. So keep this in mind as well, okay? Skills outlasted preps. Obviously, we all know that. You can take skills with you no matter what. But the skills they're talking about was learning to fix things, right? Learning to fix shoes and learning to fix people. Because things break, but if you can fix them, they work again. Shoes don't just magically make themselves. So when they wear out and there's no more new ones to take from the store, you gotta fix them or else you don't have shoes, and no shoes in an SHTF event is basically a death sentence. And obviously fixing people, AKA medical, is extremely important when there's no one else around to rely on, okay? Hygiene killed many, many people. So some of the more simple things in life were very important to have lots of. And when I say that, I mean garbage bags, okay? Disinfectant, soap, just basic items, toilet paper, right? The things that you don't think are that valuable now become extremely valuable when they run out. And think of this when you're considering some of these ideas we're speaking of right now. If you go to the grocery store once a week, let's say, and every single week you have to buy more of something because you always run out of it before you hit the grocery store again, that might be something that you need to have more of because you're using so much of it so quickly. Things to consider, okay? Now, gold and silver had value, and that's something we talk about a lot here in the preparedness community. However, gold and silver was traded mostly, at least in the case of Selko Begovic, for ammunition. Interesting that ammunition actually became more valuable than gold and silver during those times. And a lot of people add that into their precious metals list when they're talking about the possibility of SHTF, and there's good reason behind that, okay? Another thing was to make your home base very unattractive. Don't have the most expensive looking house on the block during an SHTF event. And don't have things that make it look like you have things to protect. AKA, if you have bars on your windows and you have surveillance systems and you have floodlights and everything else that makes your home look like a fortress, enough people can still get into your home and take what you have. And if you look like a fortress, there's probably something that you're protecting within. And these are things you have to consider that were brought to light during this process for the survivors of the siege of Sarajevo. Sorry. All right. At first the weak perish, and then the rest fight. That was something else that was within this conversation, saying that everyone who was weak just kind of like disappeared really fast. But at the end, everybody else that's left who is strong all had to fight for everything else. And that is also a scary situation. So either way, there's going to be some very dangerous times, whether or not you're weak or strong, okay? And then a big takeaway from this conversation was, at least in his opinion, in Selko's opinion, you need guns and ammo first before everything else. Because what he experienced was that by having a large family that was decently armed, they were able to survive. But people who were alone or weren't armed were picked off very quickly and taken over because they had no way to defend what they had. And numbers and firepower matter. And so in his opinion, having all the things you can possibly have doesn't matter if you don't have a way to protect them. And with what he saw with organized gangs roaming the town and taking what they wanted unless they were met with force, is that if you didn't have force, it didn't matter what else you had either. And that's an interesting takeaway from this entire conversation. I will put a link to this interview in the description as well as in the pinned comment, so that way you guys can check it out. But I think that these are very interesting times, and I think that because Bosnia is in Eastern Europe and because of everything happening there now, that we should reflect on some of this information and really take it to heart when it comes to what we could expect. Terrible things happened in Bosnia. There was ethnic cleansing, there was mass amounts of crimes committed against women, and there's a lot of other terrible, terrible stuff that occurred there. And like I said, this is modern history. This is early 1990s. This is not some kind of medieval situation that we're talking about here. But people became very medieval very quickly. And I think we can also expect that if we have any similar experience, no matter where we're located. So, I wanted to bring this to your attention. Hopefully this conversation gave you some things to think about, especially with this concept of war on the horizon. I mean, we're hearing about it every day at this point, and I don't have much faith in anybody's ability to make things better anymore. So what do you expect to see happen? You let me know in the comments. But this is such a good topic that I will be making another video similar to this one about the siege of Sarajevo, and I'm also going to go ahead and talk about some of the items that ran out very quickly in regards to that particular situation to give us another way to focus on what we should prepare for during these times. So hopefully you found this information very useful. If you have any other questions for me at all, go to magicprepper.com, and that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.